The physician arrived at 3:30 on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of October, and Edmund Cavendish, Viscount Westhorn, received him in the library because it was the room in the house where no one else had reason to go. The man was old. He had been old 3 years ago when Edmund had last consulted him, but the intervening years had done their particular work, and Dr. Poster. Aldrich Peel settled into the chair across the desk with the careful deliberateness of a man who has stopped pretending. He does not require assistance to rise from it. Edmund noticed the hands on the desk's edge. They were trembling. He poured 2 glasses, and said nothing. Dr. Peel said, "I am dying, my lord. I am told I have some weeks. I find I cannot go with certain knowledge on my conscience, and so I have come to you." He did not pick up the glass. "What I tell you now I should have told you 3 years ago. That I did not is the longest failure of my professional life, and I make no argument in my defense." Edmund set down his own glass. The fire was behind him. Outside, the October light was gray in particular, the quality of it that came in the second week of autumn when the leaves had mostly gone. He said, "Say it plainly." Dr. Peel said, "Your wife did not die." The words landed in the room without a vent. A coal shifted in the grate. Edmund heard his own breathing, which was slow, which surprised him. "Lady Westhorn," the physician continued, "survived. She survived because she was not in the coach when the accident was reported to you. She had been removed from the coach some miles before the accident, removed and placed on a post-chaise traveling north. The accident was arranged. The death was reported to you as fact. It was not fact." He stopped. His hands on the desk edge had tightened. "She is alive, my lord. As of 3 weeks past, she is in London. I have reason to believe she is employed in the household of the Countess of Alverston as a lady's companion, under a name not her own." Edmund did not speak for some time. He became aware, distantly, that the room had changed around him, that the library he had stood in 10,000 times looked different, subtly and permanently different, the way a room looks when you understand that something you believed about it was wrong. He had stood in this room 3 years ago and been told his wife was dead. He had stood in this room and felt, alongside the grief, the cold undercurrent of guilt that he had identified at the time as grief's dark sibling. He had signed papers. He had signed papers on the recommendation of Dr. Peel, papers that would have sent Cecily to a private establishment in Wiltshire for the treatment of nervous disorders, and he had signed them because Dr. Peel had told him she was dangerous to herself, and because his mother had sat in that same chair and told him it was the only merciful thing left to do, and because he had been 29 years old and afraid, and had trusted the man in front of him. He said, "Who arranged the accident?" Dr. Peel said, "Your mother came to me. She paid for the carriage. She gave instruction that Lady Westhorn was to be removed before the coach reached the establishment, and that you were to be told your wife perished on the road." He paused. "I allowed it. I told myself Lady Westhorn was better served by freedom than by the institution. I told myself it was a mercy. It was cowardice, my lord. I allowed a woman to disappear from her husband's life and her own name, and I allowed you to believe she was dead, because it was easier than telling your mother." No, Edmund stood. He walked to the window. Outside, a carriage was passing in the street below, the horse's hooves steady on the cobbles. He watched it until it was gone. What he had done, the thing he had done that could not be undone, was sign papers he should not have signed. He had done it because he had trusted 2 people he should not have trusted. He had done it in the belief that he was acting out of care, though he understood now, 3 years and too many sleepless hours later, that the care had been easier to feel than the inconvenience of a marriage that had grown silent and hard and airless. He had not wanted to confine her. He had told himself he had not wanted to confine her. He was no longer certain what he had wanted, only that he had signed his name and handed the pen back to Dr. Peel and felt, underneath the told himself mercy, a relief he had never once permitted himself to name. She was alive. She was in London. She had been in London for 3 weeks within the same few square miles where his mother was arranging a dinner this very evening, at which Edmund was expected to formally begin his courtship of Lady Eugenia Holt. He said, "Get out of my house." He said it quietly, without heat, because the quiet was all he had left. "Leave the name you were given for. Where she is. Leave it on the desk, then. Get out." The physician rose. He set a piece of folded paper on the desk beside Edmund's untouched glass. He left without speaking again. Edmund heard his slow footsteps in the hall, heard the front door, heard the street noise come in briefly and close again. He stood at the window a very long time. He thought about what it meant to have been wrong in a way that could not be corrected by the usual methods. He had been wrong about accounts before, and wrong about tenants, and wrong about the yield on a field he had trusted too early, and in each case the procedure was clear enough. You acknowledged the error, you absorbed the cost, you adjusted the figures going forward. He had signed papers that would have sent a woman to an institution in Wiltshire, and the woman had escaped, and for 3 years he had been permitted to believe the error was moot because she had not survived to live inside it. She had survived. The error was not moot, it was the most present thing in the room. There was a folded piece of paper on the desk, beside his untouched glass. He did not yet open it. He looked at the fire, which had burned low, and at the decanter on the side table, and at the room that had looked different since the physician sat in it. The season's first assembly dinner was in 4 days. His mother had already ordered the flowers. The 3 years since Cecily's reported death had not been, as Edmund's mother frequently suggested, a period of healing. They had been a period of management. He managed Westhorn House and its attendant properties in 2 counties, and its tenants and its accounts. And he managed his mother's increasing confidence that she had placed her son's life on a better trajectory than the one his wife had represented. And he managed the season's expectations, which had gone from delicate sympathy in the first year to patient inquiry in the second, to something approaching impatience now, in the third, as Lady Vivian Cavendish presented one candidate after another, and Edmund declined each one in the same unremarkable way he declined most things that required him to feel. He was 36 years old. His hair had begun to go silver at the temples. He had acquired, sometime in the past 3 years, a stillness in his person that people described as gravity, and that he understood as something rather closer to absence. He was present in every room he entered, and accounted for, and correctly placed, and he was not in any room at all. His mother sat across from him at breakfast, with the serenity of a woman who believed herself to have been right about most things. She was 61, and the diamonds she wore even at breakfast caught the morning light, and the manner in which she held her fan when other women were speaking communicated a quarter-inch distance from all of it that had in Edmund's early years impressed him as composure, and had latterly come to resemble something he could not quite name. She had married him well, she maintained. She had managed the unfortunate first situation with discretion and care. Lady Eugenia was the correct next step, and tonight's dinner at the Cavendish townhouse would begin the process with appropriate momentum. She said, that morning, passing him the salver, "Dr. Peel came yesterday, I understand. I hope there is nothing amiss with your health, Edmund." Edmund said nothing. He was watching the place where her hands rested on the salver's handle, the particular stillness of them, and thinking that he had never once, in his life, seen his mother's hands tremble. "Nothing amiss," he said. She smiled and let the subject pass. Cecily had been awake since before the household stirred. This was habitual. The work of a lady's companion was not arduous in the way field work or factory work was arduous, but it required a precision of attention that she had found, over the past 3 years, could only be properly sustained if she gave herself the early morning hours in which to be no one at all. She used those hours differently, depending on the day. Sometimes she attended to the small mending she did in exchange for the incremental improvements the Countess of Elverston permitted to her room. Sometimes she sat with the letters she did not send. Sometimes she did nothing except sit in the kitchen passage with a cup of tea and the particular quiet of a house not yet performing itself. The brooch was pinned to the inside of her pelisse. It had always been pinned there. She had in the early weeks told herself she kept it as evidence, in case evidence was ever required. She had stopped telling herself that within the first year. She kept it because she kept it, which was not a reason she could have named to anyone, and because she had never been able to make herself place it in the tin box under her narrow bed, where she kept the few things that were genuinely hers. The police hung on the hook behind her door. The brooch was there when she needed to see it, which was not often, but sometimes. It was a small thing. Enamel on gold. No larger than her thumbnail, a spray of 6 forget-me-nots in pale blue with a center of painted yellow. He had given it to her in the 2nd month of their marriage, on a Tuesday in November. For no occasion she had been able to identify. He had simply placed it on the breakfast table beside her cup, inside a folded piece of paper, and said nothing, and gone back to his correspondence. She had pinned it to her morning gown and worn it all day, and at dinner that evening she had watched him across the table in the candlelight to see whether he would look at it, and he had once, briefly, when she reached for the salt, and he had not said anything then either. That was before the marriage became what it became. She did not permit herself to think about what it had been before. She only permitted herself to think about the brooch as a specific object, metal and enamel, and 6 small petals, which was not the same thing at all. She was 27 years old. She was called Miss Carteret in this house, which was her mother's name, and therefore not precisely false, and the Countess of Alverston had known, almost from the beginning, that it was not the whole name, and had not asked for the whole name, and had demonstrated a consistent and pragmatic understanding that the companion she required did not need to be identically named to the companion she employed. The Countess was 81 and had outlived 2 husbands and a son and most of her contemporaries, and she had the specific patience of people who have watched enough disasters unfold to know that the correct response to most of them is to continue pouring the tea. "You will come tonight," the Countess said that afternoon from her chair by the fire, not looking up from the cards she was arranging in a long, unhurried row. "The Alverston ball is not an occasion I shall attend alone." "The footman could attend you," Cecily said from behind a length of mending. "He is significantly larger than I am and considerably more useful in a crowd. The footman does not know the names of the people who matter, which is the primary function I require you for." The Countess placed a card. "There will be an engagement announced this evening. Possibly 2. Lord Westhorn is expected to attend with his intended, which will give the east side of the ballroom something to discuss for the balance of the season." She paused. "I trust this is not a difficulty." Cecily looked at her hands. The mending needle was very still between her fingers. "No difficulty," she said. She had known he was in London. She had known since the first week of the season, when a passing carriage had displayed the Westhorn crest on its door panel, and she had stopped walking entirely for a moment on the pavement, one hand on the iron fence of a park railing, until the carriage had turned the corner, and the street was ordinary again. She had made a series of rational decisions in the weeks following. She would complete her employment with the Countess through the winter. She would seek a position in Bath or Bristol, somewhere that required none of London's specific social machinery. She would not think about Edmund Cavendish more than once per day, and she would not think about him during the hours that were supposed to be for sleeping. She had managed one of the 3. The Alverston ball was held in the principal rooms of a house on Portman Square, and it was crowded in the way that October balls were crowded, the season's beginning producing a specific quality of collective energy that later balls, when the novelty had distributed itself more evenly. Wool. The chandeliers were lit from end to end. The orchestra was in the gallery above the east door. Cecily stood 3 paces behind the Countess of Alverston, and slightly to her left, which was her customary position, and which afforded her an excellent view of the room, while allowing her to be comprehensively invisible to it. She saw him across the floor before he saw her. He was by the terrace door, and he was not looking at the terrace. He was standing in the way he had always stood at events that required him to be present in them, which was, with his full attention, directed at a point slightly past the nearest person, his glass held level, his face composed into the particular expression she had once learned to read as exhaustion, wearing the mask of distinction. He was taller than she remembered. The silver at his temples was new. He was with Lady Eugenia Holt, who was dressed in ice blue silk, and who was beautiful in the specific way of women who have been told so frequently that they are beautiful, that the information has become architectural. And the Dowager Lady Westhorn stood at Edmund's other side, with her fan at the angle that meant she was arranging something. Cicely became aware of her own heartbeat, as a physical fact. It was very loud. She heard, somewhere to her left and behind her, a woman say to her companion, "They say the first wife was something of a ghost even before she died. Poor Edmund. He deserves better than a ghost for a beginning." The companion murmured something in agreement. Cicely looked at the floor. She looked at the pattern of the parquet, which was a herringbone, which she counted briefly and without purpose. Then she looked up again, because the Countess required her to know the names of people. And the Countess was moving toward the refreshments table, and Cicely was required to follow. She did not look toward the terrace door again. Wah! She felt, with a precision that she had never successfully argued away in 3 years of practice. The moment when he saw her, it was not a sound. He made no sound. He was across a crowded ballroom, and there were 2 orchestras worth of conversation between them. She knew when his attention moved, the way she had always known it. From the very first weeks of their marriage, when she had not yet understood that knowing where he was in a room was not a quality she had chosen, but a quality that had been chosen for her by her body's particular and inconvenient insistence on his presence. She kept her eyes on the Countess. She kept her expression as she had learned to keep it, which was pleasant and attentive and entirely without weather. Later, during the interval between the second and third sets, she was asked to fetch the Countess a second cup of negus, and she made her way to the side table and was standing with her back to the room, when an elderly gentleman to her left suddenly lost his footing. He had been reaching for his own cup and had leaned too far, and the result was a cascade of punch that would have covered 3 people, had Cicely not moved in the same instant, catching the cup with one hand and steadying the gentleman with the other, and directing both with a composure that she was not, in the moment, particularly aware of, as composure, because she was more occupied with the cup and the gentleman's dignity and the footman who materialized at her elbow to take the cup before anything else spilled. She righted everything. The old gentleman, a Mr. Forsyth, thanked her twice. The footman, a young man who had been at the table no more than 6 weeks, and who looked as though he feared imminent dismissal, was quietly assured that nothing was broken and no one would hear of it, and she said this in a register too low for anyone else to catch while handing him a cloth. Mr. Forsyth thanked her a 3rd time. She returned his cup to him, and his dignity to him, and found the Countess's negus, and turned back toward the room. Edmund was standing at the near edge of the refreshments table. He had been there. She understood long enough to have seen all of it. He was looking at her hands. He had been looking at her hands since the first moment of the incident. He had watched them move through the whole sequence of it, the catch and the steadying and the cloth produced from somewhere. All of it done in the time another person would have taken to register that something had spilled. The hands were not graceful hands. They were capable hands, slightly reddened at the knuckle, and they moved with a specific economy he recognized from people who have learned not to waste motion because motion has cost them. He had known nothing about what her 3 years had been. He knew something now. He knew that she had been in service and that she had made herself excellent at it, and that she had done this quietly and without anyone required to witness it, and that she would have gone on doing it without any witness at all. The knowledge sat in him with the weight of something that arrives too late to be useful and proves itself useful, regardless. She met his eyes for a moment. He did not look away first. She did, because she was carrying 2 cups and had somewhere to be. She crossed the card room at the ball's end of its 2nd hour, intending to retrieve the Countess's wrap from the chair where she had left it, and she had the wrap in her hands and was turning to leave when he came through the door behind her. The card room was nearly empty. 2 elderly gentlemen in the far corner over a game of piquet, uninterested in anything else in the world. A single brace of candles on the mantelpiece. The door was open behind him, and the sound of the next set drifted through from the ballroom, and Cicely stood with the Countess's wrap in her hands, and calculated with a precision born of 3 years of calculating exactly how much space existed between herself and the nearest exit, that she was not going to be able to cross the room without passing within 6 feet of him. She had spent 3 years not being within 6 feet of him. She had spent 3 years doing a great number of things she had not anticipated spending her time on. She looked at the door. "Miss Carteret," he said. He was watching her. His voice was what it had always been, quiet, at the register where other men's voices rose, and it did the same thing now to the space between her ribs that it had always done, which she acknowledged as information and declined to act upon. "My lord," she said. She kept her hands on the Countess's wrap. He said, "I spoke today with Dr. Peel." She went very still. The name landed in the room with the particular weight of a name one has not heard spoken in some years. She had thought about this moment. She had thought about what she would say. She had had 3 years to construct a response that was composed and adequate and closed further inquiry. She found that none of those responses were available to her. She said, "I see." "He told me," Edmund said, "that you are alive." He said this with a flatness that was not cold, but was the sound of a man reciting something his mind has not yet finished receiving. "He told me what my mother did. He told me what I did not know. He told me he arranged your removal before the accident, and told me nothing, and that you have been in London 3 weeks. He paused. His jaw was at the angle she remembered, the one that meant he was keeping something below the surface by direct application of will. "I did not know you lived, Cecily." The use of her name was quiet. It was not a weapon. She had half expected it to be a weapon. She said, "You signed the papers." "Yes, you signed papers to commit me to an institution." "Yes." He did not flinch from it. "I signed them on the recommendation of a physician I should not have trusted, and at the urging of my mother, whom I trusted less than I believed. I signed them in the belief that you were unwell, that you required care, that what Peel told me was true. It was not true." He stopped. Something moved through his face, not quite pain, not quite the thing she might have wished to see. Something older and harder and more honest than either. "I should not have signed them. Whatever Peel told me, whatever my mother argued." "I should not have." Cecily said no. "You should not have. I believed you were dead. For 3 years." "I know what you believed," she said. "I had rather more than 3 years of knowing what you believed, my lord. I had 3 years of the consequence of it." She set the Countess's wrap over her arm. Her hands were steady, which was the thing she had most faithfully maintained, and which cost her most. "You ask me to accept that you did not know I survived. Perhaps you did not. The papers were signed regardless. I know that. Then you were the last person in England to know you had a wife," she said, and the words came out level and quiet, and not quite as cold as she had intended, and the silence after them was considerable. He stood in it. He did not argue it. She left the room because the Countess was waiting, and because there was nothing else to do, and she did not look back. The dinner the following Tuesday was held at the Cavendish townhouse, a long table set for 30, the candles in the silver candelabra throwing a warm and particular light across the faces of the season's principal company. Cecily was not meant to be there. The Countess of Alverston had been invited on the basis of an old friendship with the late Lord Westhorn's second cousin, and had accepted and had informed Cecily 2 days prior that her attendance was required to manage the Countess's correspondence cards and her hearing difficulty and the specific challenge posed by Lady Harrington, who sat on the Countess's left at every dinner and spoke in a register below the old woman's reliable range. Cecily had said nothing. She had pressed the police flat on her lap that evening and looked at the outside of it and thought about the thing pinned to the inside, and then she had gone to press the gray silk gown she had retrimmed 3 times and never quite managed to make look as though it had not been retrimmed. She sat at the lower table near the window, the Countess to her right, and Lady Harrington to the Countess's left as predicted. The upper table was visible from where Cecily sat, which meant that the Dowager Lady Westhorn was visible from where she sat, and Lady Eugenia beside her, and Edmund himself, at the table's head, his face in profile as he spoke to the gentleman on his left. The dinner progressed through its courses with the measured pace of such events, and the conversation at Cecily's table was of a sort she could manage with a portion of her attention, while the rest of her attention went to the specific discipline of not looking toward the head of the upper table more than was necessary. Lady Harrington asked the Countess about a mutual acquaintance in Bath. The Countess gave a measured reply. Cecily translated the reply, at the appropriate volume, for Lady Harrington's right ear. It was work she was good at, and work that had the advantage of keeping her face occupied. She heard the Dowager's voice before she understood what was being said. Lady Vivienne Cavendish had the gift of making a statement at one end of a table audible at the other without appearing to raise her voice. It was a gift of register rather than volume, a particular frequency that cut through ambient conversation the way a fine thread cuts through silk. She said clearly enough that the conversation at the upper table paused. "My son is at liberty, as I have been at some pains to establish over these 3 years, and the lady at my right hand is the correct choice for the next Viscountess Westhorne. I trust the matter is settled." She paused. "The first wife is a ghost. Let her remain one." The table was quiet. Not silent, not the way a room goes silent when something consequential happens, but quiet in the way a table goes quiet when something has been said that several people find worth attending to. Cecily did not look at the head of the table. She looked at the candle in front of her, the specific height of the flame the way. It was entirely still, because the windows were closed and there was no draught, and she thought that she was very tired, which was a thought that was precise and true and encompassed rather a lot, that she did not have language for in a dinner setting. She was not going to cry. She had not cried in 3 years, and she was not going to cry now, in a room full of people who had just been told she was a ghost, in front of a woman who had paid for a carriage to make that ghost plausible. She was going to finish the dinner and take the Countess home, and in the morning she was going to write to an agency in Bristol about an available position. She heard the chair. She heard it because it was the kind of sound that a room hears even when the room is not particularly listening. A long table's worth of scraping that produces a specific quality of attention in everyone present. Not alarm, but the particular alertness of people who understand that something consequential is occurring. She looked up. Edmund had stood. He was at the head of the table, and he did not look at his mother, and he did not look at the woman to his left. He picked up his glass, set it down again without drinking, and pushed back from his chair. The room was watching him. The Dowager Lady Westhorne's fan stilled at its current angle. Lady Eugenia's expression moved briefly through something that was not quite composed, and then rearranged itself. He walked the length of the dining room. It was not a long room. It was 30 feet perhaps from the head of the table to the near end of the lower table, and he covered it in the particular way of a man who has decided something and is executing the decision without the theatrical freight of a man who wants to be watched executing it. The room watched him regardless. 30 people's worth of attention following him down the room the way the room's attention always moves when it understands that something is being transacted, that will have social consequences. He stopped at the lower table. He stopped at the place where Cecily sat. She looked up at him. He was not looking at the table, or the candles, or the room. He was looking at her face, and his expression was the one she had last seen in the card room 2 nights ago. The older and harder and more honest thing underneath the composed surface, except that now the composed surface itself had come down, and she could see the whole of it. He held out his hand. The room was very quiet. "She is my wife," he said. His voice was at its usual register, the quiet one, the one that carried because it did not need to rise. "She has always been my wife." Somewhere near the upper table there was a sound of a glass being set down, with more force than intended. The Dowager Lady Westhorne had closed her fan. It was the first time Cecily had ever seen that specific movement happen involuntarily. Cecily looked at Edmund's hand, which was open and still, and thought about the papers he had signed, which were a fact, and thought about the 3 years she had spent as a ghost at someone else's insistence, and thought about the card room 2 nights ago when he had not argued that he should have acted differently. She thought about all of it, and then she did not think about any of it, because the alternative was to sit at the lower table of the Cavendish townhouse dining room while 30 people watched her refuse the hand of the man who was still, legally and in every sense that the law and the church and the social machinery of the Regency world recognized. Her husband. She put her hand in his, a solicitor named Mr. Tent. Norris, who had been seated 3 places from Edmund's left on the upper table, and had come to this dinner with papers regarding the Westhorn estate that bore no relation whatsoever to the current scene, but who had been a solicitor long enough to recognize when he was in the presence of a legal situation resolving itself in real time, rose from his place and said, in a carrying voice, "I should note, for the satisfaction of any present who require the confirmation, that a marriage legally contracted and not legally dissolved remains a legal marriage, and that no circumstance of the intervening period, including reported death not confirmed by documentary evidence, alters this fact." Nobody at the table spoke. The dowager sat with her closed fan in her lap and did not look at anyone. Lady Eugenia, to her left, said very quietly, "To no one in particular. I had wondered. One does wonder." Cecily stood because Edmund's hand was there, and because sitting was no longer the right thing. She was aware of the room and the candles and the 30 people and the dowager's particular stillness, and the solicitor who had just delivered a legal opinion nobody had asked for, and everything else, and she was aware of all of it at a small remove, the way one is aware of weather outside a window. She was aware of his hand around hers. That was the thing that was close. The Countess of Alverston from her chair, 2 seats to Cecily's right, said, with the composure of a woman who had seen more than this and thought this probably ordinary, "Excellent. Now perhaps someone might clear the fish course." The Countess of Alverston's sitting room at 10:30 that evening was lit by 2 branch candlesticks in the fire, and it smelled of the lavender the Countess had brought up from the country, and the specific smell of a room that had been a room for a long time. The Countess herself had made it 12 steps inside the door and then said, with the cheerful lack of pretense of the very old and the very knowing, that she believed she was tired and was going to bed, and the sitting room was available to anyone who required it. She had then gone to bed, and Edmund had sat in the chair opposite Cecily's, and the fire had burned down by 1 log's worth of time. They had not spoken on the carriage ride. There had been too much to say and no syntax that could contain it, and the carriage had been doing the thing carriages do in November, which is to keep a specific silence of their own that is not uncomfortable. The Countess of Alverston had sat between them with the serene impracticality of a woman who has long since stopped pretending she does not know more than she is asked to know. And she had looked out the window and made one observation about the weather, and that had been all. In the sitting room, the fire had burned down to a bed of orange coals, and Edmund had put 2 more pieces of wood on it, without being asked, and the room was warm. Cecily sat in the chair the Countess usually occupied, which was the better chair, the one with the higher back that held you, rather than tipped you forward. She was aware of him across the small table, the specific quality of him in a room, the way he had always displaced the air around him in a manner slightly larger than his physical presence. She had forgotten that. Or, rather, she had not forgotten it, but she had arranged her memory of it in a place where it did not have daily access to her, and now it did. Cecily said, "Your mother will not accept it." "No," Edmund agreed, "she will not. She will accept it eventually, because she has no practical alternative, and because I am going to make the practical alternatives very limited for her." He was looking at the fire. His hands were on his knees, very still. "What she did was not something I can address by conversation alone. Norris will spend the next several weeks being quite thorough." "She believed she was acting correctly," Cecily said. She did not know why she said it except that she had spent 3 years with the fact of what the dowager had done, and had found somewhere in the middle of the 2nd year that she could not sustain the version of it in which his mother was purely monstrous, because purely monstrous people were simpler to manage than the real kind. She believed the marriage was a disaster, and she found a method of ending it that left no obvious blood. She did not consider that the method had a cost. "She never does," Edmund said. "The cost is always paid by someone whose accounting she is not personally responsible for." He was quiet for a moment. "The marriage was a disaster." We ought to say that plainly. If we are going to say anything plainly tonight. Yes, Cecily said. It was a disaster we produced together. I was cold and I was absent and I was occupied with everything that seemed more manageable than the specific difficulty of being in a room with you and not understanding what you needed or what I wanted or how we had arrived somewhere so far from where we began. He said this to the fire, not to her, which was the only way either of them could have heard it. I signed papers I should not have signed. That is also true, and I am not going to ask you to set it aside. Paul. Ha. I know what you are not asking, she said. I am asking, he said, whether there is something on the other side of all of it. That is what I am asking. I am not asking you to forgive it tonight. I am not asking you to make a decision tonight about any of it. I am asking whether you think there is something on the other side. Cecily looked at her hands in her lap. She looked at the inside of her right wrist, where the blood moved, where it had moved all through dinner, with a particular awareness of the man across the table, an awareness she had spent 3 years trying to reasonably argue out of existence and had never successfully managed. She put her hand into her pelisse, through the inner opening, and found the small pin at the lining. She unpinned it. She held it for a moment in her closed palm, feeling the small raised enamel of it, the 6 petals of the forget-me-nots, the cool metal back. Then she opened her hand and set it on the low table between them. He looked at it. She watched his face change, which was not a dramatic change, not the kind of change that would have been visible from across the room. It was the kind of change that happened close up, a settling of something, a grief that had been one shape becoming a different shape. He reached out and picked the brooch up. He held it in both hands for a moment, looking at it. Then he set it back in her open palm and closed her fingers over it. He did not let go of her hand. Outside the sitting room window, the October wind moved through the plane trees of the Alverston Square, the bare branches making their particular sound against the glass, and the candles burned down to their next hour. And neither of them spoke for a long time, which was not the same as silence. It was the beginning of something for which neither of them yet had the words. It was enough for tonight to know that the beginning was there. If Cecily's journey moved you, leave a thought in the comments. Stories like hers, the ones that begin with a ghost and end with a hand, deserve to be told twice.